Hello, everyone. Welcome. Okay, class, it's time to settle down. I hope you made it through your final exams in good order. The registrar will be checking on your grades soon. I'm Dan Palazzolo. I'm co-director of the Marshall Center, and I'll welcome you here on this Thursday afternoon for our final lecture of the year. And it's seems like a good time to say thank you to a few people who have been so important to the Marshall Center. We're going to do that, and then I'm going to introduce Dr. Kevin Cherry, who's going to introduce our speaker. One quick program note. We do not have a reception after this particular event, so I'm sorry about that. You'll have to stop at a brewery on the way home or something. I'm not sure whatever your pleasure is. The first person that I want to thank a few people on our staff who have played such a great role in the Marshall Center. Shannon Best is in the back. See Shannon back there? Let's applaud her. Everything we do at the Marshall Center, everything that runs so smoothly runs through Shannon, and every once in a while she has to keep us on task, but we're so grateful for what she does for the Marshall Center. And right near her is Susan Taylor. She works behind the scenes as well. There's Susan. She's the... She keeps us on task. She makes sure that I don't spend too much money. That's never a problem with Gary McDowell, but it is a problem with me sometimes. And we have Michelle Bedsall as well, and Stephanie Trent back here, also helping out. And of course, I want to thank the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, Dr. Sandra Peart, who's right here to our left. And I have one more very special thanks, and that is to my colleague Gary McDowell, who is responsible really for the Marshall Center. We have had 4 grants from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation, and now we're in our 10th year. And Gary is the person behind all of this. He has gone through a couple of directors, but his main role has been essentially to come up with great ideas for speakers, come up with great ideas for programs. He has helped to hire a number of postdocs, one of whom is actually back visiting with us today, Hugh Liebert, and has been the mainstay of the Marshall Center for 10 years. At some point you have to retire, I suppose, even though we don't want that to happen in this case. And Gary has announced his retirement. He is now Emeritus Professor of Leadership at the University of Richmond. And he is going to continue as a senior executive consultant extraordinaire at the Marshall Center. But we thought it would be appropriate to give him just, a couple of gifts as a token of our appreciation. The first is a book called Without Precedent by Joel Richard Paul, which has just come out, and it happens to be on Chief Justice Marshall. And the second is a bottle of wine called The Federalist, which is all appropriate for Gary. So I'm going to hand these to Gary. Would you please applaud our director? All right, thank you for that warm applause and welcome. I just told Gary, just share one more thing with you, that the bottle of the Federalist was a whole lot cheaper than the scotch that he drinks. So, Susan, please take note. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Kevin Cherry, Associate Professor of Political Science, who will introduce our speaker. Kevin?
I'm glad I didn't have to be the one to announce that the reception was not going to be held tonight. If you're familiar with Plato's Republic, they do promise a banquet that they never actually have, because the banquet is replaced by a wonderful speech, and that's what we'll have this afternoon. It's an honor and pleasure to introduce that speaker, Michael Zuckert, Nancy Reeves Dreux Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Zuckert did his undergraduate work at Cornell University and his graduate work at the University of Chicago. He taught at Carleton College for several years before moving to beautiful South Bend, Indiana in 1998. It is customary at events like this to say that the speaker's credentials are too numerous to list in the brief time allotted, and in Dr. Zuckert's case, that happens to be true. I tried to count his articles and book chapters, and my math isn't good enough. I ran out. But let me focus on his books. He's the author of several important books, 3 of which really put him at the center of discussions about the intersection of the American founding and modern political theory. I don't remember their titles because when I was in graduate school, we always referred to them by their color. With his wife, Catherine, who spoke here a few years ago, he has also written 2 books on the work and influence of Leo Strauss, and he has published numerous articles on the history of political thought, on thinkers ranging from Plato all the way to Rawls, and on the American regime from its founding to its contemporary dilemmas. He writes, and writes well, not only on Madison and Machiavelli, which you might expect, but also Shakespeare and Sophocles. As one might expect from an aficionado of James Madison, Dr. Zuckert has done much work to develop institutions that support the study of political theory at Notre Dame. He served as the department chair, and he was the driving influence behind the creation of the program in Constitutional Studies and the Tocqueville program. And somehow, despite all he does as a scholar and as an administrator, he is exceptionally generous as a mentor. He gives excellent advice about developing courses and research projects. He helps find outside funding for students so they can devote themselves to their writing, and he works hard to place them in long-term positions. That means writing a lot of letters of recommendation. He involves students in his research and has co-authored several publications with them. Given this generosity, it is unsurprising that he has served as a member of many dissertation committees, including my own. He offered numerous suggestions for improvement, particularly in revising the dissertation for publication as a book. But perhaps his greatest contribution was to make sure that, despite my tendency to panic, the dissertation defense was a relaxing affair by attending it dressed in a toga. It was Halloween, but I don't think that had very much to do with it. In addition to all his other responsibilities, Dr. Zuckert is founding editor of the journal American Political Thought. He has been involved in the writing and production of several documentaries about the founders, and he makes a great baklava. Michael Zuckert does a lot, and he does it all with energy and good cheer. His talk this afternoon, and I hope I vocalized the punctuation correctly, is on Abraham Lincoln, a model of democratic leadership. Please join me in welcoming Michael Zuckert.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that very kind introduction. I always worry about getting nice introductions because it puts a lot of burden on my performance, so if it disappoints you, blame Kevin. Also, it's a delight to be here. This was a complete surprise to me on the day that Gary McDowell is retiring. I've known Gary for many years. I can't remember how long, nor how I met him or why I know him, but I do. And I just want to lend my congratulations and hopes for a great future life to Gary in his retirement. Now today, in my talk, I would like to accomplish 3 things. First of all, I would like to present Lincoln's theory of the nature of democratic statesmanship, which I hope will be your theory too when you hear his reasonings. Secondly, I want to present some reflections on the relation between what we might call political principle and political pragmatics as related to political action. And then thirdly, I'd like to lay out Lincoln's reasoning in favor of what he considered the most important principle of political action, that being that all men are created equal. And I'd like to challenge you to consider whether you consider that argument valid, persuasive, or not. Now, I'm very pleased to come, not merely for Gary's retirement, but to come here to the University of Richmond, to the John Marshall Center for the study of statesmanship, I think. Yes, is that right? And as a venue for presenting these thoughts. It seems to me that in general, political science as a field does not pay enough attention to the issues raised by the questions of statesmanship, the issues of the character of the men and women who run our government, of the quality of those leaders, and so on. And it seems to me the case also that very few places, this being a major exception, actually spend attention on the question of citizenship in the way it deserves to be attended to. So I'm happy to do my little part to contribute to the mission of this important institution here. Now, in this context, Lincoln especially comes to my mind, and I hope to yours, because as of last President's Day, Lincoln was once again named to be the most important or the greatest political statesman in American history. And surprisingly, though, if one studies Lincoln very much, one comes to see that for somebody who was so highly rated, he has also been pretty harshly criticized, both in his own time and in our time. I'm going to not so much talk about the criticisms of Lincoln in his time, but those in our time. I want to start with those. So in the 20th century, I know that's ancient history now, but in the 20th century, there were two waves of criticism of Lincoln, corresponding for the most part to the two halves of the 20th century. The first wave was sponsored by some of the great historians of the American Civil War, who came to reconsider Lincoln's statecraft, especially as practiced in the pre-Civil War period. Their criticism of Lincoln goes something like this: that Lincoln took an overly radical and moralistic position in the pre-war period, and together with the abolitionists and some other Republicans, he transformed a conflict that could have been settled peacefully, that could have been compromised, and he turned it into a situation with all the earmarks of a Greek tragedy. The Civil War, these historians want to say, was not inevitable in itself, but rather Lincoln and his friends made it so by their intransigence. Lincoln famously had said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. Now, these historians believe that Lincoln, by pronouncing and then acting on the principles of this, from his House Divided speech, created the situation and the climate of opinion in which the South could do naught but see his election as a declaration of war against them and their institutions, and thus to give them no choice but to leave the Union when he was elected president. What Lincoln stated as a mere prediction, however, was for him an imperative of policy, and he was resolved not to allow the destruction of the Union when the effort was made to do that. So now, the now unstoppable force of Lincoln-inspired Southern fear met the immovable object of Lincolnian resolve to preserve the Union. Once the issue was defined in this way, the Civil War was as inevitable a result as Oedipus killing his father. Now, this line of argument about the Civil War and Lincoln became powerful during the first half of the 20th century, and it was associated with a more broad national reassessment of the end result of the Civil War itself. The segregation system had replaced slavery in the South, while Northern opinion lost all zeal that it had held for any sort of civil rights agenda, for remaking the South, or for any sort of sectional conflict that would interfere with the now, racing economic development of the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. So reading backwards from national accommodation to the peculiar racial patterns in the South, Americans began to wonder whether the Civil War, which up until World War I was the most destructive war in human history, whether the Civil War had been worth it. Many historians breathing in the spirit of their own age, redefined the war as preventable, with Lincoln and the abolitionists as the chief villains in snatching war from the jaws of peace. So these historians varied a good deal in the motivations that they attributed to Lincoln. Some of them attributed his actions merely to poor judgment, as was, they thought, visible at the outbreak of the fighting when he called for 75,000, I should say, volunteers to serve for 3 months. A small, quick war seems to be what Lincoln had in mind. To put these numbers in some sort of perspective, you may already know this, the Civil War left nearly 620,000 Americans on both sides dead. And it lasted 4 years, neither quick nor small. Others see the episode even less favorably to Lincoln. So there's a very famous essay by a very famous historian called Abraham Lincoln and the Self-Made Myth. And this essay attributed all of Lincoln's actions to nothing so much as his personal ambition. This historian argues that Lincoln was willing to risk all, to risk the future of his country and the lives of his countrymen so that he could hold high office. Ironically, the charges raised against Lincoln in the second half of the 20th century are more or less opposite to the charges raised earlier. Not his intransigence, it was now emphasized, but his half-heartedness, the narrowness of his motives, of his actions and his views, the deep conservatism of all that he did and thought. These were the new targets of attack. This line of thought about Lincoln emerged, as you might guess, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. Lincoln, these critics insist, may have signed the document that freed the slaves, but he didn't much like black people. He did not want to free slaves. He favored the interests of whites only, and he did not see America as a place for whites and blacks to live in together. In the final analysis, these charges amount to the dread accusations of racism, conservatism. He was always talking about the founders, the fathers, our fathers, and all that they achieved, and pro-capitalism, because he frequently spoke of the merits of free markets and free labor. So the two sets of charges against Lincoln are, I think, very serious. On the one hand, he is said to have been drastically deficient in his statecraft, not much of a statesman, that is, deficient politically. The other set of charges amount to the claim that he was deficient morally. Now, my task this afternoon is to think a little bit about Lincoln, partly to defend him. I suppose it'll come out more defense than anything, but partly merely to ruminate over Lincoln and over what statesmanship might amount to. And I want to deal with the various charges raised against Lincoln in the context of his famous debates with Stephen Douglas during the campaign for the Senate in the state of Illinois in the year 1858. Now, that debate concerned, for the most part, a very simple question. What should national policy with respect to the presence or absence of slavery in the territories belonging to the United States be? What should the policy with respect to slavery in the territories be? Now, here was an election campaign in which the candidates treated the half-educated electorate, who turned out really in droves, huge crowds, and who sat there for 3, sometimes 4 hours as intelligent, informed, or at least capable of being informed and capable of judging for themselves the most important issues facing the nation. I will not pause to make the obvious comparison to the electioneering, the candidates, and the electorate of our time. I'll leave that to you. In these debates, each of them stood for one policy in particular. Douglas stood for the policy of territorial self-determination, or as he called it, popular sovereignty. Lincoln stood for the policy of prohibiting slavery in the territories, at least in those territories north of the old Missouri Compromise line. Douglas's policy, I want to speak of that first. Douglas's policy was actually a brilliant solution to an intractable problem of politics, both high and low politics. His policy was very simple. Instead of Congress deciding whether slavery should go into those territories or should be prohibited in those territories, Douglas' view was that the people of each territory should be allowed to settle the question for itself, or as he called it, self-government. The issue was particularly important because if slavery was once allowed into one of these territories, these are territories belonging to the nation but not yet formed into states, if slavery entered those territories before they became states, the inevitable result was they would enter the Union as slave states. And if slavery was kept out of those territories before they became states, they would pretty much inevitably come in as free states. Now, given the way representation in the Senate works, that is, 2 representatives for each state, and given the way the Senate representation counts in the Electoral College and therefore in the election of the president, the number of free versus slave states was a matter of great importance to all sections of the country, as it really mattered whether states came in one or the other. Therefore, the strongest political passions were focused on Washington when the question of allowing or not allowing slavery in the territories was on the table. All of national politics was in effect caught up in a sectional conflict focused on this issue of slavery in the territories. And it was a highly explosive, combustible situation with, if you think things are bad in Congress now, they were way worse then. People would beat each other with canes and such. It was a very difficult situation. Now, Douglas's solution to this problem was actually quite elegant. As he said, as he saw it, the principle of America is indeed self-government. Therefore, his thought was, let the people of each territory govern themselves. Let them decide for themselves what will happen with regard to slavery there. Why, he thought, in language that is very reminiscent of today, why should Washington decide? Why should Washington dictate a solution? Douglas thought that he had found a way to settle what appeared to be a union-threatening conflict with this simple solution. The center of conflict would no longer be Washington, but would be the territories themselves, so that it would kind of diffuse the conflict and take it away from the center of the government. This was, I think, a masterful effort to deflect and disarm what could be violent conflict. It was an effort to avoid what was becoming the most contentious element of this conflict as well. So for Congress to make a statement, to make a policy about slavery in the territories, is for the national authorities to take a stand on whether slavery is a good thing, a right thing, or a bad thing, or a wrong thing, or not. It amounted, Congress's to take a stand amounted to a national endorsement of either the principles of the slave states or of the principles of the free states. And since Congress had forbidden slavery in the past, the Southerners felt as though their special institutions and values were being disvalued. And they demanded that their institutions be recognized as at least equally valid as Northern institutions. And in fact, great efforts were being made in the South to reconceive the whole situation, the relationship between what we might call now capitalism and slavery, which they made many arguments to the fact that slavery was a more humane and better system of labor, of having a labor force than was the free labor system in the North, among other arguments that they made. Now, Douglas's popular sovereignty policy then gave the South at least something of what they wanted, which is, if not a national endorsement of slavery, at least a secession of a national condemnation of slavery. It, in effect, committed the nation as nation to being neutral, to not having a stand one way or the other on the rightness or wrongness of slavery. Now, Douglas's popular sovereignty policy left, as I said, the national government to be simply neutral between the northern principle of freedom and the southern principle of slavery. As Douglas frequently said when he was out campaigning, he said something like this. He said he didn't care whether slavery was voted up or down by the local voters, just that it be voted. That was his position. But Douglas was not so personally neutral about the spread of slavery as this formulation might lead you to believe. He himself was not particularly favorable toward slavery, nor toward the spread of slavery. And he believed, though, that slavery came into an area, a locality, not because of laws that people passed about it, but rather because of climate. As he understood it, climate made possible certain kinds of agricultural systems and made impossible certain others. And that there were some agricultural systems that were well suited to slavery, and there were others that were not. So his idea was that whether slavery entered a territory would depend actually on nature and not on all this fighting about the laws. And so his idea was that the outcome could be decided and that slavery would not necessarily expand as much as some people hoped it would. The outcome would be decided by nature, and we could leave all these harsh conflicts to the side. We could get the same result without the political conflict. So that's his idea. Now Douglas's position, I think we can see. We'll have to test we'll have to ask the authorities on statesmanship over here at the John Marshall School if they agree. But we might say Douglas's position looks like a statesmanly position for sure. It aimed to promote political peace and harmony, and to avoid both the Scylla of disunion and the Charybdis of civil war. And no wonder, then, that some historians come to condemn Lincoln for intransigently framing the issue in such a way as to prevent Douglas's pacific and apparently, how should we say, humane, I guess, policy from succeeding, and thus forcing the nation to face first the Scylla of secession and then the Charybdis of civil war. Now, I have to say at the beginning of my considerations of Lincoln that Lincoln did everything in his power, absolutely everything in his power, to prevent the country from adopting Douglas's policy of popular sovereignty. He had, by early 1850s, he had mostly dropped out of politics roughly around 1850 after having served one term in Congress. That was his whole national political service prior to becoming president. He had turned his attention more seriously to his legal practice than he had ever done before, and for the first time was beginning to make a little money at it. He was getting railroads as clients, and railroads were the best clients you could have in the 1850s. His plans changed in 1854, however, when a law called the KansasNebraska Act was brought into place. Among other things, the KansasNebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise, which I'm sure you all remember from high school history, had drawn a line across the territory purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. And north of that line, slavery was just prohibited. And this bill, KansasNebraska Act, which was sponsored by Douglas, repealed the Missouri Compromise prohibition on slavery in the territories, and instead put in place his doctrine, Douglas's doctrine, of popular sovereignty. The local territories would decide for themselves whether they would have slavery or not. Now, when this doctrine or this law was passed, Lincoln's change of direction was quite remarkable. He turned back to politics, and he seemed to have only one object in doing so, and that was to show the perniciousness of the Douglas policy and the corresponding, as he put it, propriety of the restoration of the Missouri Compromise. He insisted that the question of substantive principle, that is, the question of the inherent right or wrong of slavery, could not be pushed aside, as Douglas tried to do, in favor of a purely procedural solution that popular sovereignty represented. Now, this may seem the obviously right answer, but we can't rest so easy with it. Conceding that Lincoln is correct about the moral evil of slavery, it's still a fact, that he was not about to change the minds of the slaveholders or their allies. Moreover, he was very far from an abolitionist himself. He conceded that despite the moral evil of slavery, there was no power in the national government under the Constitution to interfere with it in the states where it existed. And he knew that the states which had slavery were not about to abolish it anytime soon. So it's not all clear then that any good could follow from Lincoln's policy, but it certainly was clear to Douglas that much political evil could follow from what he was trying to do, that is, bringing back and encouraging all the conflict that had preceded the KansasNebraska Act. So Lincoln's position could indeed look to be quite irresponsible. Now, in 1854, Lincoln explained quite lucidly why he left this about to become lucrative law practice and why he took it upon himself to speak out against the leading politician, Douglas, in Illinois, who was also one of the very leading politicians in the whole country. It was because, he tells us, this is quoting Lincoln, "I hate this declared indifference to the spread of slavery." Hatred, a pretty strong sentiment from a man who, in his second inaugural address after the war, preached malice toward none and charity for all in the context of a war in which hatred and malice was the theme of the day. Now, Lincoln hated the Douglas policy of indifference to slavery expansion, and he came out of his semi-retirement to voice that hatred and to try to make others feel it also. And this is what he said about why he hated it. "I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, and especially I hate it because it forces so many good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principle of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest." So Lincoln hates Douglas's approach for its effects on three different groups of persons. First, its effects on the slaves themselves. They are victims of this monstrous injustice of slavery. Second, its effects on those foreigners who are enemies to America and to republicanism and who are hardened by the existence of slavery in the midst of a country claiming to be free, because this proves to them the hypocrisy of the Americans. As Samuel Johnson, who was one of the first people to write an encyclopedia, a dictionary, I should say, as Samuel Johnson said at the time of the American Revolution, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" And third and finally, Lincoln hates the effect on many good men amongst ourselves because it leads them into opposition, he said, to the Declaration of Independence and the principles of political right. Perhaps surprisingly, Lincoln identified its effects on this last group as the effect that he most especially hated. Now, Lincoln was definitely onto something when he saw slavery to be turning good men, or seemed to be good men, and certainly many men, against the Declaration of Independence. I'll mention one example, Senator John Pettit, who was the senator in 1854 from my home state, Indiana, present home state. I'm leaving first opportunity. Senator John Pettit, on the floor of the Senate, stood up and called the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie. Now, from Lincoln's point of view, perhaps the most discouraging sign of the war slavery provoked against the Declaration of Independence was a decision by the United States Supreme Court in the infamous Dred Scott case. In that case, the Chief Justice of the United States said that the Declaration of Independence could not possibly have been meant to apply to members of the African race, as he put it, who he concluded had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This is a fulfillment to a T of what Lincoln had feared in 1854, that good men would reject the very principles of political right and instead insist that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Now, all three of Lincoln's points end up being variants of his first point. Douglas's policy ignores the monstrous injustice of slavery. It is this injustice that robs American institutions of their power of example in the rest of the world. It is this that robs Americans of their own attachment to their own historical principles. But I want to bring out one thing that might not be clear. It seems to me that Lincoln's point here is a bit more subtle than it might seem. It is not slavery itself that does these bad things as much as the Douglas approach to slavery. That is to say, the declaration of official indifference to its rightness or wrongness. Lincoln thought slavery a monstrous injustice, but he thought it would have to be lived with for the time being, and that it could be, so long as the prohibition on the spread of slavery remained in the law to serve two crucial purposes, one of which was to affirm the inherent wrong of slavery by not being neutral about it. That's first. And second, to give what Lincoln called, to give the public mind reason to believe that slavery was in course of ultimate extinction. Now, in that second wave of criticism of Lincoln after the Civil Rights Movement, he was blamed for being so tolerant of slavery as this. He was blamed for opposing intransigently and immediately not the evil itself, but what seems to be the peripheral matter of the spread of the evil, all the while affirming his willingness to tolerate the evil where it exists. Now, Lincoln apparently hated Douglas's indifference about slavery even more than he hated the evil of slavery itself. But we can understand his reasons for opposing Douglas's efforts toward a statesmanly settlement, as well as his reasons for not going further in an abolitionist direction, only if we listen to what Lincoln argued against slavery to show its inherent injustice. So here's a simple syllogism that Lincoln relied on. Premise number one: all human beings are equal, or restated, all human beings possess equal rights, or restated again, or all human beings possess rights to themselves. Premise two: the blacks are human beings. Conclusion: therefore, slavery of the blacks, or that, for that matter, of any human being, is unjust because it is a denial of human equality, it's a denial of human rights, it's a denial of the right of self-ownership. Lincoln, as you can see, was no relativist. That is clear. He did not believe that this was merely his value judgment, that slavery was wrong. Rather, he insisted it is wrong, and a decent politics must recognize that fact. But he also knew that not everyone accepted his syllogism. In particular, the first premise of this syllogism had come under increasing attack in Lincoln's, in the years immediately preceding Lincoln's political action here. What then is Lincoln's argument in favor of his first premise? First premise: all human beings are equal, all human beings have rights, etc. So he made actually three chief arguments in favor of this first premise, that premise against, in favor of equality and against slavery. The first And probably his most common argument was an argument from feeling, okay? Keep that, an argument from feeling. It went like this. In 1854, he told his audience, addressing them directly, "Your sense of justice and human sympathy continually tell you that the poor Negro has some natural right to himself." Later on, he says, "Repeal the Missouri Compromise. Repeal all compromises. Repeal the Declaration of Independence. Repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery extension is wrong." It is certain, Lincoln asserted another time, that the great mass of mankind considers slavery a great moral wrong, and their feeling against it is not evanescent, but eternal. It lies at the very foundation of their sense of justice. Nature, as expressed in the universal or near universal promptings of the human heart, nature teaches that human beings are equal and that slavery is a terrible wrong. But nature, it turns out, is not the only source of Lincoln's knowledge, of Lincoln's claim in his first premise. He says in one important place, he says, "My ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another." By his ancient faith, Lincoln, of course, means the Declaration of Independence, a statement not universally known and delivered by the human heart in the natural feelings of all people, but rather a proposition put forward in a specifically American document. It is Lincoln's, or our faith, not the faith of mankind in general. Where Lincoln's first argument appeals to universal nature, his second appeals to history, to a particular deliverance of our history. These two arguments, perhaps not contradictory of each other, are nonetheless quite different. I hope you'll agree to that. Now, to these two arguments, Lincoln adds a third argument, very different from the other two, where the others are, in one form or another, non-rational arguments, appeal to feeling or an appeal to faith. This one is a rational argument, an appeal to reason. So here's how it goes. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. You don't mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superior of the blacks and therefore have a right to enslave them? Take care again. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. Now this is, I think you'll all agree, a very simple argument, yet I think it's a very powerful argument. It is what is known in some circles, take this home, write it down, a dialectically necessary argument, whatever that means. It depends on a claim that each and every one of us, makes for myself. I feel, I know in my bones, my own claim to freedom, that I am free and want to be free and need to be free. I cannot help but see this and cannot help but assert this claim for myself. And what Lincoln's reasoning makes me see is that I cannot go on to affirm the enslaving of another without endangering, in principle, my own freedom. To affirm slavery for another is to affirm slavery for oneself. As Lincoln said in another place, although volume upon volume is written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself. Or to put it even more simply, Lincoln said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." Now, as you may have noticed, this argument also contains an appeal to feeling, just like his first argument. But there is an important difference, which perhaps you've already noticed. In the first argument, the so-called universal feeling is a direct revulsion against the slavery of others, against others being enslaved. In this third argument, it is a direct revulsion against slavery for moi, slavery for myself. Lincoln, I think, is on solider ground and knows that he is in affirming the universality of this feeling about oneself than he is in the former argument about affirming revulsion against slavery for all others. As he concedes, after all, volumes and volumes have been written to justify the slavery of others, but no one willingly chooses this state for himself. In a word, Lincoln's third or rational argument is much better as an argument. As a matter of logic, as a matter of clear thinking, Lincoln proves that one can accept slavery for any person only on pain of self-contradiction. But Lincoln knows that human beings do not consider the pain of self-contradiction the worst pain that they might suffer. He once sat down to consider the case of the Reverend Dr. Ross of Alabama, a slaveholding man, a conscientious man of God, who came to ask himself the question whether his slave should be a slave. Dr. Ross, he wrote a book, by the way, so that's where Lincoln is getting this from. Dr. Ross can receive no direct answer or unambiguous answer from the Bible, which has got sort of ambiguous things about it, and he certainly never bothers to ask his slaves their opinion on the matter. So at last, Lincoln says, it comes to this, that Dr. Ross is to decide the question, and while he considers it, he sits in the shade with gloves on his hands and subsists on the bread his slaves are earning in the burning sun. If he decides that God wills that these slaves be free, he thereby has to walk out of the shade, throw off his gloves, and delve for his own bread. Will Dr. Ross, Lincoln asks, be actuated by that perfect impartiality which has been ever considered most favorable to correct decision? The Reverend Ross is more willing to suffer the pain of self-contradiction than the pain of hard labor in the hot sun. Only if human beings generally found the pain of self-contradiction less tolerable than other sorts of pains would rational argument be as conclusive in practice as it turns out to be in theory. What makes a proposition true and what makes a proposition effective as a maxim of action are in fact quite different things. This is the single most important truth about politics. This disparity sets the task for statesmanship, to make the true and good and right also the effectual, or to bring these elements as close together in practice as is possible. This is both what holds politics and morality together and what separates them. This is what separates the tasks of the moral philosopher and the scholarly critic from the political actor of the highest kind. No political actor in American history, I would argue, understood this truth more fully and acted upon it more thoughtfully and creatively than Lincoln did. So Lincoln made, to recap, Lincoln made three arguments against slavery. An argument from a direct feeling against it, an argument from our faith, and an argument from reason. The argument from reason was true, but as such, ineffective. The argument from feeling was effective so far as it was true, that is, so far as people actually felt that feeling that he was talking about, and many did. Reason ascertains truth, feeling prompts action. But the feeling against slavery for others is fragile. Lincoln knew perfectly well of many people who held slaves without revulsion. Reasoning points to the truth of the anti-slavery position, but reasoning is ineffective without the support of feeling, and feeling is unreliable. It is too variable, too tied up with self-interest, too uncertain in itself. It needs to be formed, focused, and channeled. In this context, Lincoln's other argument against slavery comes into its own, the argument from our ancient faith. That is, from the American, what used to be, the American consensus on the Declaration of Independence. The fragility of both reason and feeling points to the need to cultivate fundamental moral and political truth in the mode of faith. Like the ancient faith of God's people, this is our ancient faith, our inheritance from our fathers, some of whom lived right here in Virginia. Lincoln preaches the universal and rational truth of freedom as the particularistic and non-rational inheritance of this people and of its history. He attempts to attach the reverence reserved for the most sacred and venerable things to the fundamental truths of political life. The task for Lincoln's statesmanship is to make the Declaration of Independence an object of an almost religious attachment. He took the truths of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, who were two men of the Enlightenment, who thought that rational argument plus self-interest would suffice to create a decent society, and he infused their truths with the spirit of religion and poetry. Now, it should be clear why Lincoln saw that he had to counter the apparently statesmanly accommodation of Stephen Douglas to the accommodation Douglas was trying to get the nation to accept. Douglas might perhaps gain some temporary political peace, although that did not in fact happen, but his policy would endanger the conditions for the future political health of the nation, for it would further wean the nation away from its ancient faith, from that unreflective belief and feeling in favor of universal equality of rights and of freedom. Worse than the existence of slavery itself, in other words, is the spread of the view that slavery is a matter of indifference, that the nation can and should be neutral. So long as the moral evil of slavery is reaffirmed, so long as the ancient faith is kept alive, then, Lincoln claimed, one could rest in the belief that the evil would be abolished from the land in the course of time. Lincoln knew that his intransigence carried risks, but he knew that the alternative was much worse. He knew also that the disparity between what is true and what is effective means that at any moment, the one who understands this relation between morality and politics properly must always settle for less than morality or the abolitionists demanded. But he must always also keep the moral principle alive so that another statesman, another day, might aim at a more far-reaching conjunction between the moral truth and the politically efficacious feeling. This task is different in detail for us today than it was for him, but in form it is just the same. And I can do no better than to close out my talk about Lincoln by quoting from his speech against the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, which I seem to have lost the quotation. Here it is. Okay, good. This is Lincoln. The framers of the Declaration of Independence defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal in certain inalienable rights. This they said, and this they meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all men were then enjoying that equality, nor yet that they, that is the founders, were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for a free society which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked up to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and the value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. For Lincoln, the statesman, this is what made America great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, to which I have to admit I have never thought about. But I would say this, that Lincoln. I quoted from the House Divided speech in my talk. In the House Divided speech, if you remember, he says the nation cannot survive half free and half slave, and it'll go one way or the other. And when Lincoln wrote that speech, he previewed it with some of his advisors. And Lincoln was somebody who actually took his advisors' opinions seriously. That is, he didn't just, dismiss them. And to a person, they said, "Don't give this speech." But here was a case where he actually did not listen to his advisors and indeed gave the speech. And afterward, he paid a price for it. He was much criticized for it. But he said later on, if all the things that I have ever written or said were destroyed but one, that is the one thing I would keep. And I would say that's Lincoln choosing that he would not be so bothered by the criticism of those earlier historians as he would be by the moral criticism of the later 20th century. I think what he would say to that criticism is, I'm with you, except what you want would not have been possible at that time. And if I had spoken out for those things you wanted me to speak out for, I would have been just like those other abolitionists who got no traction politically, whatever, and we'd still have slavery. So that, I believe, is the case. Yes? As well, I knew somehow I was inviting a question like that, and I don't want to be too partisan. I think he would say in some ways something very similar to what he said, which is we need to remember our ancient faith, that is the faith of the Declaration of Independence and its principles, because I think present management of the country doesn't particularly remember or cherish those principles. And that would be a good place to start. That's what I think he would do. Yeah.
I'm so fascinated by what you said about the emotional and logical arguments that Lincoln made. They're sort of like William Wilberforce in England, who this passionate middle of the night speeches that did away with the slave trade.
Yeah.
And a rather long and protracted way of arguing this point. But they did not end up with civil war, and we did.
Yeah.
What was the difference?
Well, the difference is this, so England was a major participant in the slave trade, and there was a lot of money being made by English merchants in the slave trade. But England had no domestic slavery. And so that fact, I think, made a tremendous difference. There wasn't the same kind of local group with a status quo interest in maintaining slavery or expanding slavery that there was in the U.S. So I think that, it was a big struggle to get what Wilberforce did was a major achievement, but it was a different situation. I think that accounts for the different outcome. Yeah.
What criticism should we lay at Lincoln's feet for Reconstruction? For what I'll call a lack of a plan for what?
Well, he had a plan. I mean, unfortunately he died before he could put it much into effect, but he had the outline of a plan. One of the things in his second inaugural address, when he speaks about malice toward none and charity for all, what he's really speaking about is his desire to forge a Reconstruction policy that would be more gentle and generous than the Reconstruction policy that Congress was fostering. There were plans by Congress on the table of what they wanted to have happen, and it was much more punitive. So Lincoln's idea was to take one example, he told General Grant that if Jefferson Davis should somehow manage to find his way to Canada, that would be fine with him. That is, we don't need to have trials for treason, we don't need to have a lot of vindictiveness. And this is at a time when, feelings really ran high. I mean, it was every family had suffered in the Civil War. It was such a devastating war on both sides. And so Lincoln, in a way, Lincoln's idea was, both of us, both sides, we've both been punished already for the sin of slavery that we both shared in. And so his idea was, let's, as we say now, let's move on. And so I would say he had a plan. It's just that people weren't eager to follow it. Anything else? Where? Oh, there you are. Oh.
What can we learn from Lincoln about how a democratic statesman has to engage with the prejudices of his age, especially rhetorically? Because some of us, when we're reading Lincoln today, some of the most difficult passages are when he seems to be indulging a little bit the racial prejudices of his age. So when he says, just because I don't want the black woman as a slave doesn't mean I have to want her as a wife.
Right.
Which is technically true, but it seems like he's indulging or playing to the prejudices of his
Right.
audience a little bit there. So what is the democratic statesman supposed to do? Prejudices that he can't just transform, but also doesn't necessarily want to
Right.
enhance.
I think Lincoln's principle, or the principle of a democratic statesman, has to be that, look, this is a democracy, and the prejudices of the people count for something. I mean, they count, at least electorally, they matter. And so one is going to have to make concessions to them. That is just the hard truth. And so the democratic statesman needs to, in a way, be a morally tough person and be willing to take on himself, perhaps, some positions that he himself feels uncomfortable with. But I think Lincoln's rule always was, yes, I have to make these concessions, but I want to do it in such a way that I can achieve my immediate goal. So for Lincoln, his first goal was to try to somehow get rid of slavery. And then we're going to worry about what kind of society comes after that. We'll worry about that next. But I don't have, as a vehicle to getting rid of slavery, I'm going to make concessions to the fact that most white opinion in the country, that is most of the opinion that mattered politically, is against the idea of a mixed race society. And so, but I think Lincoln would say, these concessions that I'm making if we get freedom, we can face then the question of what these concessions I made have not ruled out moving beyond where we are when we get rid of slavery. So I think it's a hard and sad truth about the political life. The political life requires doing things that are morally questionable, I guess you'd have to say. I mean, at least in words, if not in anything else. Okay, are we?
Thank you.